Good morning to you and happy Father's Day. I hope you have a blessed day as we do celebrate with our fathers. Now, this morning I'm going to start into the Gospel of John, a series through First John, rather, which was written by the Apostle John due to a pressing matter that was happening at that time. It seems that many who had at first been participating in church assemblies were rejecting the faith and now departing from those churches they had attended. For we find that they no longer wish to hold to the fundamental teachings of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Particularly, they were denying the deity of Jesus Christ, that he and the Father are one, and rejecting the cross of Christ as the sufficient means of salvation and the only means of salvation. Essentially, as one looks at First John, it is noticeable that the same doctrines that are put forward and rejected by the Jews in the Gospel of John are the same ones, the same doctrines that are put forward in First John and rejected by this current movement he mentions in chapter 2. The chief difference between the two, John's Gospel and First John, is that John's Gospel was written to encourage people to accept Christ, that they would come to faith in him and join in the fellowship of the body of Christ. In contrast, First John is written to warn against turning away from Christ, to abandon him, and to withdraw from these church assemblies that they had been participating in. Thus, the first, John's Gospel, desires people to accept the gospel teachings. The second, First John, warns against turning from those teachings. And there we find how these two kind of fit together. Now, let me say something about the background of this letter, if I may. The place of writing and the recipients, on both of these, we really don't know who they are. The early church says that it was written from Ephesus, but we really don't know that. Also, in the earliest times, it said that the recipients of this letter were the Parthians. If you don't know who the Parthians were, they were a great empire at that time. In fact, they were Rome's most formidable enemy. They were the ones who stopped the expansion of Rome eastward. They were halted, and the Parthian nation, which took up what is now present-day Iran, writers say that it was written to them. But we don't know that either. The fact is, this undoubtedly is a letter that is called a circular letter, which was passed around and intended to be passed around to the various churches to combat this specific problem that was happening, which we will address in the letter. Clearly, there were those who had, at one time, as I said, participated in church assemblies, but now were rejecting the doctrines of the gospel and leaving the church. This problem seemed to have been widespread, so just as was the case with John's gospel, First John also was written to be passed around to the churches in general. Enough on that. Now, the time of writing and its purpose. John does not express clearly the time of this writing, but dating it has to be based on how one interprets the situation that is mentioned in chapter 2. And I believe you can get a general time sense of this. Now let's read what is written in 1 John chapter 2, verses 18 and 19. We read the following. Children, it is the last hour. And just as you heard that Antichrist is coming, even now many Antichrists have appeared. From this we know that it is the last hour. They went out from us, but they really were not of us. For if they would have been of us, they would have remained with us, but they went out so that it would be shown that they all are not of us. Now we are told here that there were many who had left various Christian assemblies, and that this departure indicated that John and his contemporaries were in the last days. Or excuse me, not only in the last days, they were in the last hour. The mention of many antichrists implies that this was a movement and that this movement was quite broad in scope. Not just one assembly, but apparently numerous assemblies were affected by this. Now, we are not to understand that the last hour is the last hour that takes place at the end of the church age. It's not referring to that, which would make it thousands of years down the road from John's situation. It's not referring to the last hour as far as the end of the church age. Nor can the last hour refer to the whole church age, as though the last hour refers to the whole church era, which has now been going on for 2,000 years and still counting. I bring those up because you'll see commentators mention both of those views when they talk about this. But the last hour cannot mean either of those. Rather, it is already the last hour, says John, present tense, and the reason John and his readers know it is the last hour is because they already have many antichrists all around them. So that's how they know. So what does the last hour then refer to, we might ask? Since we will study this section in fuller detail later on, pulling out the scriptural references to make a case and to understand the situation, for now, I just want to say this expression has to refer to the final hour of the Jewish nation under the Old Covenant. When comparing the Gospel of John, for example, with 1 John and looking at the evidence from the rest of the New Testament, particularly the history of the book of Hebrews, or the book of Acts, and also the whole book of Hebrews, the book of Hebrews addressing a large Jewish departure from the church assemblies. That is why the book of Hebrews, by the way, was written, because there was this Hebrew departure from the church. It is my conclusion, looking at the evidence, that the New Testament especially acknowledges this Jewish departure, and this is what it's referring to. For example, if you look at Acts, we do not find hardly any Jewish converts after the first decade or two in the book of Acts. This would mean that from 30 to 50 AD, there were many Jewish converts, probably just within the first decade. But you really don't see a movement taking place in Jerusalem in much of its later years. We also find that the greatest opposition to the gospel in the churches, even the churches that were located in Gentile cities, were from the Jews, who had rejected this message of the gospel. Paul twice says this in the book of Acts because he's frustrated with the response of the Jews to the gospel. He says, from now on, I'm going to the Gentiles, because they're responding. The book of Hebrews, for a moment, we look at that, was also written, as I said, in large part for the same reason as 1 John. Hebrews lays across the deity of Christ and the exalted position of Christ, warns against this Jewish departure from the Christian assemblies that was taking place. Large part it was due to the persecution that was occurring in Judea and Jerusalem. But there was this departure from the gospel that is mentioned in the book of Hebrews. And Hebrews explains to them the sufficiency of the saving work of Jesus Christ. Again, the doctrines are very similar in Hebrews to what they are in 1 John, to what they are in John, although written from different perspectives. It is Christ's death on the cross that saves, not the practice of the covenant law. That is the argument of Hebrews. Also, when we look at the New Testament seems to imply that the most persecuted churches were those in Jerusalem and Judea. In fact, Paul made it a point to take up collections from the Gentile churches in order to take to what he considered the impoverished, persecuted church of Jerusalem. They were probably, I believe, the most persecuted churches in the first century world. Jewish Christians were struggling because they were under such a heavy hand of the Jewish people. And we find that what was rejected in the Antichrist movement, as I said, was the deity of Christ and his oneness with the Father, a oneness that not only concerns having the same divine nature, but a oneness in divine teaching and a oneness in the Father's plan of salvation through the Son. This is precisely what the Jews also rejected in John's gospel, and what the author of Hebrews also has to explain in the book of Hebrews to try and keep them into this saving faith of Jesus Christ. Another point to consider. The Old Testament uses the term last days or latter days when it's referring to the end of the Jewish dispensation. Indeed, I mean, it would take me a while. I could go through this for a long time. Some of you know this. But it is called the latter hours or the last days, the latter hours, excuse me, the latter days or the last days is used in the Old Testament when explaining that because the Jews were so hard and had rejected the covenant of God, that God was going to come and remove the nation completely from its covenant privileges. You see, that removal, the removal of Jerusalem and temple, was regarded by the prophets as the last hour, or the last days, I should say. But here we find that John uses the term the last hour. It is not that he's referring to some movement that's different, but it's the same movement. Now, let me give you an example of how, in the New Testament, the term last days invariably speaks of the last days of the Jewish dispensation. And really, it's easy to demonstrate this from the context. But let me take the book of Hebrews, for example. Hebrews 1:1 and 2 reads this. God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers and the prophets in many portions and in many ways, in these last days has spoken to us in his Son. Now here the author of Hebrews begins his introduction, and you have to understand the content of the book of Hebrews. But he says God long ago has spoken to us through the prophets. Well, long ago, I mean the most recent prophet from the time of the writing was about 500 years. That's long ago. That would be Malachi, Zechariah, for example. So long ago, God has spoken to us through the prophets. In these last days, he's spoken to us through his Son. Am I supposed to assume that the last days means the whole church age? I don't think so. Really, what he's referring to is that it is now in the last days because the dispensation, since Christ has appeared, we know this from the Old Testament prophets, that in the appearance of the Messiah, one dispensation was going to be removed. The age that the current Jews were in, that present age, was going to be removed, and Christ would bring in the age to come. And so that time has now come. Jerusalem is going to be removed, the temple is going to be removed, and the Messiah is going to commence his reign. And so the last hour is a reference to the removal of the Jewish dispensation because they had rejected the covenant. Also, let me say something about the term Antichrist. We read about Antichrist here, and we'll get into this more later on. But the term Antichrist, it's simply a transliteration of the Greek Antichristos. And in 1 John, it refers to a movement which concerns this first century departure from the church. That's what it refers to. Many who had first acknowledged the gospel were leaving the church because they could not accept the doctrine of the fullness of the deity of Christ, nor that his death on the cross, that his blood was sufficient for salvation. This is what was being rejected by the Antichrist. Now, we know that his death is completely sufficient. And we know, of course, that Jesus is the Son of God. And John will emphasize this. John, the Gospel, emphasizes this. 1 John emphasizes this. Now, it also may shock you to know that the word Antichrist is not found in the book of Revelation at all. It's not there. Everybody, you have commentaries on Revelation. They always talk about this Antichrist in the end. Well, I hate to spoil your fun, but the word Antichrist isn't used in the book of Revelation. In fact, the Bible never uses the term Antichrist for one person at the end of the church age. Never does. And no one should interpret it that way. The word never pertains to it. Again, we will examine this more fully, the meaning of Antichrist, when we explore 1 John in more detail. But suffice to say for now, Antichrist in 1 John is a movement that was during the first century that had to do with the rejection of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the rejection of his full divinity, and the rejection of the sufficiency of his death on the cross. That's what the movement entailed. And therefore, because they could not accept those teachings, they left the church to go their own way. Now, let me say something also about this. We're going to learn that it is difficult to maintain the doctrines of Jesus Christ if you do not assemble with the believers. Okay? Just know that that's the case. People who think they can just watch Joel Osteen on TV or some of these other preachers on TV, that somehow it's going to just encourage them sufficiently to follow Jesus Christ, it isn't going to happen. The command by John is to have fellowship one with another, because the fellowship with one another is what strengthens the doctrines we believe and what strengthens our walk with Jesus Christ. We are to assemble together as the scriptures command. Now, one other thing on dating. Everybody likes dating. I mean, you dated a girl when you were young, right? I mean, or gals, you dated a boy when you were young, right? Everybody loves dating. Well, I like dating too, but let me say something about the dating of the New Testament letters. And all the books of the New Testament, by the way. It is hard to believe that any of the New Testament books were written after 67 AD. I find it hard to believe that any of the books were written after 67 AD. And here's why. You have the Jewish Wars. The Jewish Wars took place in 67 to 70 AD. That's when Rome started a war with Israel, or Israel with Rome, tried to boot them out. And so Rome came back with a massive army and started to conquer the land, taking city by city, etc. It is hard to imagine that any of the New Testament writers would not have mentioned the Jewish wars if they were written during that time or after that time. The same may be said for the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, which took place in 70 AD. The fact that there is no mention of the destruction of Jerusalem or the destruction of the temple is very powerful evidence that none of these books or letters in the New Testament were written after that time. I know you'll find study books that say that some of these were, but that is Beauregard. It's not true, and it wouldn't have been. I'm certain of it. No, all of these had to have been written either in 67 AD or prior to 67 AD when it comes to the dating. Otherwise, they would have mentioned it. So, 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, Book of Revelation, all written by John, were probably written sometime around 67, 66 AD, somewhere in there. The book of Hebrews was probably written somewhere around 66 AD. These have got to be among the very last books. The book of Revelation, I can date it for you from my studies, was written at around 67 AD, late 67 AD. That's when it was written because of what was said to John at that time. So anyway, you have this dating. Enough on that. One more point about John. 1 John, I mean. What is crucial to John in this letter is that believers stay grounded in the fundamental doctrines of Jesus Christ. It is necessary that the church retain and teach those truths, and that the believer identify himself with those truths, both doctrinally and practically. You need to know your doctrine, and you need to live your doctrine, is what John says, to demonstrate that you really are a child of God. And so it is fundamental to John that we be grounded in the fundamental doctrines of the faith. For the Antichrist movement, for example, was really a rejection of those fundamental doctrines. And that's why they walked away. Now, in fact, I have listed 3 things they rejected, but I've already mentioned them. They rejected as the foundation the deity of Jesus Christ, that he alone is Christ, the Son of God. They rejected that. Secondly, that his death on the cross alone saves people from sin and judgment and is sufficient to save people. And the third thing, which we find the Antichrist movement rejected, they rejected keeping the commandments that were given by Jesus Christ, which are to be practiced daily in our daily living, and to love one another, which goes with that commandment, you see. So that is why. Now, 1 John will give us these fundamentals we need to live by. Now, let me close with a story to let you know how important this is. On a panel that was put together to speak on Christian apologetics. Now, Christian apologetics is not that you're apologizing. Christian apologetics means that you're defending the Christian faith. Anyway, in this panel, there was Ravi Zacharias and R.C. Sproul, among the panelists who were speaking to the audience. And Ravi Zacharias gave this testimony concerning Joel Osteen. He says, and I'm going to be reading from what he says. My wife and I were having dinner with a very notable gentleman. I shall leave unnamed, but he says that he came across more people on television, more than anyone else in the world on any given day. We were sitting across the table, and he said he came across a Muslim scholar and came away quite impressed with the fact that he had not known that there was really not that much difference between Islam and Christianity. So my wife and I were having dinner with him, and my wife, who is very well controlled in her expressions, and I thought she was going to choke at that moment. I had to turn over her and calm her down. I said to this unnamed person, "Why do you say that?" And he said, "Well, you know," he talked about all the points of agreement we have and so on. And I said, "Well, let's go from here. They don't believe we have the Bible. They do not, they believe the New Testament is lost. They don't believe Jesus is the Son of God. They don't believe he died on the cross. They don't believe he rose again from the dead. They don't believe he's coming again as king. Do you think there's a difference between what they believe and what we do?" he asked. They don't have the gospel. Then he turns to his audience and he says this, "But you know, this is the problem. The Muslims have shown us up. We don't know what we believe. When they present their ideas to average young Christians going to one of these emerging churches, one of the most prominent of those churches draws about 20,000 on Sunday, you can read his book. In that entire book of having a better life now and best life now and so on, there is not one mention of the cross in it. There is no gospel there. And so along with all the other compromises, he means that takes place in the church, we're going to be shown up. And we're not going to be able to stand as the church should be able to stand, was his point. Well, then R.C. Sproul chimed in. He spoke of listening to another TV preacher, although he said that he normally doesn't get shocked by much these days, yet he was taken back by a preacher he was listening to. And he said, the preacher said this, "I don't care who you are, what you have done, or who you have done it with, God is not angry." You get that? The preacher said, "I don't care what you have done, I don't care who you are, I don't care what you have done, or who you have done it with, God is not angry." Then R.C. Sproul comments, "What does this have to do with the New Testament view of God and sin and the cross? I mean, why would anyone need to come to Christ if God's not angry? And where the gospel talks to us about being saved from the wrath that is to come. But we don't believe in the wrath of God anymore. That's something that has to go." And what he means is that this teaching that's in the church of no wrath of God needs to be changed, because God is a wrathful God. I mean, the book of Hebrews, for example, says it's a terrible thing to fall into the hands of the living God because of judgment. So he's referring to that the church now is presenting a watered-down teaching of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and the church is not going to stand strong when the pressures come. And you know, he's probably right. I mean, I know a while back, kind of looking at this research on Joel Osteen. Joel Osteen doesn't like talking about sin. He doesn't ever. He doesn't like talking about sin, and he doesn't like talking about the cross because it offends people. Yet, on the other hand, you know, we read the Apostle Paul. He could not help but speak of the cross because it saves people, right? And this is the challenge of the church today, to stand firm in the doctrine. Folks, there is a lot of garbage out there, even on religious networks. But we are going to get grounded in the scriptures. And 1 John is going to help us to do that. So I hope you look forward to participating in this study on First John as we grow in our faith for Him and learn to stand firm in our faith despite all that's happening around us, because God has given us the strength to live for Him. Amen? Amen. Thank you for listening. God bless you. I'll catch you later. Bye-bye.